don't know if this is the right time and place. Just let me know if you want to discuss it later. But I love to talk with you for a little bit about minimalism and privilege, just because I saw a question the other day in response to one of our videos where somebody said, and I can read it if I can get my phone, but somebody said, I would like to see you all talk about minimalism for poor people, because a lot of this sounds like a bunch of people that have a lot of money and they think that spending it on expensive things is what's going to make them happy. But this seems to be a problem only for the privileged. And what about people who aren't even there yet, where they need minimalism because they're still trying to get to the point of getting the bare minimum?
Minimalism does involve the stuff, at least on the surface, but it's much more about the desire that we have for the stuff. As you know, Ryan and I grew up really poor. You can see it in our last Netflix film. You can see the house I grew up in, which is just totally crumbling, falling apart. And it was crumbling and falling apart when I was living there back in the 80s and 90s. And we grew up really poor. And the problem wasn't necessarily a lack of things. It was a desire for the things that we thought were going to solve the problems that we had. And it turns out in my 20s, when I climbed the corporate ladder, I made enough money to get many of those things. The really nice car, the oversized house, literally the white picket fence. Those things didn't make me satisfied or fulfilled. In fact, they often did the opposite, because the desire for more didn't go away. And so there's nothing inherently wrong with money, right? Money can certainly buy you comfort. It cannot buy you satisfaction or fulfillment or happiness. It can buy you temporary bursts of pleasure, but what does that do? That's hedonism. If our threshold for pleasure continues to increase and increase and increase, that ends up making us miserable. The reason I was even more miserable in my 20s wasn't because I was poor. I wasn't poor anymore, but I was broke because I carried those habits from my childhood forward. And I realized that, no amount of money is going to make me a better person, a more complete person. And I've been really touched by the people who I've gotten emails from where they said, I realized that I'm striving for something that is not going to make me happy. Thank you for allowing me to catch that before I went down the same path that you and Ryan went down, trying to achieve. In fact, the etymology of the word agony means to strive. And so no wonder we're all walking around in extreme agony all the time, because we're striving for something that isn't going to satisfy us. Now, that's not to minimize the fact that there is poverty in this world, and there's extreme poverty outside the borders of America, right? I grew up in probably the bottom 5%, maybe in the bottom 2% of poverty in America, extreme poverty. But it's nowhere near what you see in Bangladesh or India or in the Congo, right? And so it's all relative. Privilege becomes relative in that sense as well. And what I love about something that you've said, TK, we have a video on our YouTube channel called Your Privilege is Irrelevant. And it was a quote from you. And you were talking about, yes, privilege is a real thing, but simply using that term, you are a privileged person, or you are a white, cis, heterosexual male, or whatever, these things become thought-terminating cliches. Here's how I'm going to shut you down. I'm not going to open up the conversation with you because, I'm going to judge you for not who you are, but who I identify you as. And here's what I'll say about minimalism and poverty. Minimalism is applicable to anyone who is discontented with the status quo. I personally, growing up poor, would have benefited much more from minimalism, living a meaningful life within my means. You don't even have to call it minimalism. Call it living within your meansism. But being intentional with your resources is always a recipe for finding contentment, because the contentment isn't out there externally. The contentment is right here. I simply have to uncover that contentment. And if you make $1 million a year, which I have never done in my life, if you are intentional with those resources, it's going to get you farther. If you make $10,000 a year, my mom never made more than $30,000 a year, ever. And yet, we could have been way more deliberate with our resources. Here's one last anecdote for you. When I walked away from the corporate world, I was making really good money in the corporate world. but I was broke, massive amounts of debt. When I walked away, I'd finally paid off all of my debt after a 4-year plan of really being strict on my budget. That first year, I made $23,000. I took almost a 90% pay decrease, but I was more financially sound that year than I had been the last decade of making quote unquote good money, because I was now in control of my resources.
That's right on. I'm going to make a controversial statement here and say the notion that minimalism is a message only for the privileged is itself a privileged assertion that can only be made if one is out of touch with the real conditions that bring about poverty. The power of consumerism, not consumption, the power of consumerism is that it shapes our core assumptions and ambitions about life itself. And it orients us towards the world in a particular way so that we pursue particular kinds of things, we value particular kinds of things, and we see ourselves in particular kinds of ways. And this hurts the poor more than the rich, because the rich can actually afford to be stupid in ways that the poor cannot. It's like if you got a lot of leeway when you're starting out a business, you can take a lot of risk, you can go without making profit for several months and still stay in business and have time to figure it out. If you don't have a lot of leeway, you can't afford to absorb the same kinds of risk that people with more financial resources can. And I would argue that this hurts the poor far more than the rich, because it orients the poor towards the world in a way that reinforces the kind of illiteracy that must be overcome in order to create wealth. And I don't just mean reading literacy, I mean economic illiteracy, financial illiteracy, and so on. And so if you live a life where you're just constantly bombarded with ads telling you to buy Nike, that this is the kind of person that you're supposed to be, if you ever get the money, this is what you're supposed to do with it. If you ever pursue money, this is why you should pursue it. But it gives you no information at all about how to create Nike, how to invest in Nike, how to create alternative systems to the ones that you observe. You're bound to remain part of this same system with nothing more than the hope of one day getting to be a better consumer. You don't consume your way out of poverty. You create your way out of poverty. Most of these advertisements aren't empowering people to be better creators.
Yeah, that's beautifully said.
Did you enjoy this standalone Patreon highlight? If so, you can listen to full episodes of the Minimalists private podcast available exclusively on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/theminimalists or click the link in the description. Your support keeps our podcast and YouTube channel 100% advertisement free.